The cruelest marriages are not the loud ones. They are the quiet ones where one person slowly stops feeling heard. Snow drifted softly beyond the glass walls of the rooftop restaurant, while Chicago glittered beneath the winter sky 30 floors below. Crystal candlelight reflected against polished wine glasses. Investors laughed over expensive whiskey, and somewhere near the center of the table, billionaire Daniel Hayes leaned back in his chair, looking perfectly relaxed while discussing acquisition numbers with two board members. Beside him, Amelia Hayes sat quietly in a dark emerald dress with both hands wrapped around a cup of untouched tea that had already gone cold 20 minutes earlier. The rooftop air smelled faintly like cedarwood heaters, expensive cologne, and snowfall drifting through the city night. Amelia barely heard the conversations around her anymore. She was too focused on trying not to cry in front of strangers. "I just think we barely talk anymore," she said softly toward Daniel after a pause in the conversation. Her voice sounded careful, gentle, the way women speak when they are already preparing themselves to be dismissed. Daniel glanced toward her briefly while checking a notification lighting up his phone screen. "Amelia," he sighed quietly, almost amused. "Not tonight." She lowered her eyes immediately. "I am only trying to explain how I feel." One investor shifted awkwardly beside them while another pretended to focus on his drink. Daniel gave a short laugh beneath his breath before leaning back comfortably in his chair. "You know how emotional she gets sometimes," he said casually to the table. A few polite laughs followed automatically. Somebody smiled awkwardly. Another woman near the end of the table took a slow sip of champagne while avoiding Amelia's eyes completely. And just like that, Amelia felt herself disappear inside the conversation again. The humiliation was subtle enough that nobody else would call it cruel later. That was always Daniel's specialty. He never raised his voice, never insulted her openly. He simply made her feelings sound irrational until even she questioned whether she deserved comfort at all. Amelia forced the smallest smile possible because years of marriage had trained her how to survive moments like this gracefully. "I am sorry," she whispered softly. Daniel reached over distractedly and squeezed her hand once like that fixed everything. Then his attention immediately returned to business conversations happening around him. Amelia stared down at the city lights beneath the rooftop railing while cold wind moved gently through strands of her blonde hair. Somewhere inside her chest, exhaustion settled deeper than sadness. Because sadness still carried hope sometimes. Exhaustion only carried silence. 20 minutes later, Amelia stood alone inside the restaurant restroom, staring at herself beneath bright vanity lighting while muffled laughter echoed faintly through the walls outside. Her mascara was slightly smudged beneath one eye. She fixed it carefully with trembling fingers while breathing slowly through the pressure building in her chest. This was not the first time Daniel dismissed her feelings publicly. It was simply the first time something inside her no longer wanted to keep defending him afterward. Amelia leaned both hands against the marble counter and closed her eyes briefly. She remembered who Daniel used to be years ago before billion-dollar meetings and private flights consumed every corner of his life. Back when he listened carefully to her stories. Back when he noticed tiny changes in her mood before she even explained them. Somewhere along the way, success taught him efficiency in everything, including emotions. And Amelia slowly became another inconvenience he learned how to minimize politely. When she finally returned to the rooftop, snowflakes drifted lightly through the air beyond the heaters while the dinner party continued without interruption. Nobody noticed she had been crying except one older waitress quietly refilling water glasses near the table. Their eyes met briefly. The waitress offered her the smallest look of understanding before walking away again. Amelia sat back down silently beside her husband. Daniel barely glanced toward her while discussing another deal across the table. "We leave for New York Thursday morning," he said absently between conversations. Amelia blinked once. "Thursday?" Daniel nodded while reading another message on his phone. "Investor Summit." Amelia swallowed quietly. Thursday was supposed to be their anniversary dinner. The reservation had been booked for 3 months. Daniel did not even remember. She stared at him for several seconds while cold realization moved slowly through her chest, like winter settling into empty rooms. Then she looked away toward the snowy skyline again and whispered something so softly that nobody at the table heard it except herself. "I do not think you hear me anymore." There comes a moment in every lonely marriage when a woman stops trying to explain her pain because she finally understands nobody is really listening. 3 days after the rooftop dinner, snow covered downtown Chicago in thick white silence, while Amelia Hayes stood barefoot inside the massive marble kitchen of the penthouse, staring at two untouched plates of pasta slowly turning cold beneath soft pendant lights. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city glowed pale blue beneath the storm. But inside the apartment, everything felt painfully quiet except for the ticking clock near the wine cabinet. Daniel was late again. Amelia checked the time once more. 9:43. Their anniversary reservation had started at 7. By now the restaurant had probably cleared their table for another couple celebrating something happier than emotional survival. Her phone buzzed softly against the kitchen counter. Amelia looked down immediately. Flight delayed. Investor dinner ran long. We will celebrate this weekend instead. No apology. No acknowledgement of the reservation she spent months planning. Just another polished sentence written by a man who no longer realized how much damage indifference could do over time. Amelia stared at the message while the warm smell of rosemary and garlic filled the kitchen around her. Then she slowly locked the phone screen without replying. Somewhere deep inside her chest, disappointment barely even hurt anymore. That frightened her more than sadness ever had. Around midnight, the penthouse elevator opened quietly, and Daniel finally stepped into the apartment, loosening his tie while still speaking through wireless headphones. "Move the Singapore call to Monday," he said calmly while walking toward the kitchen. "No, I do not care what legal thinks. Just handle it." Amelia remained seated at the island wearing a soft cream sweater with untouched wine resting beside her. Daniel ended the call and finally noticed the candles burned almost completely down across the counter. "You stayed awake?" he asked, sounding more surprised than touched. Amelia looked at him silently for a moment before answering. "It was our anniversary." Daniel exhaled heavily, already exhausted by the conversation before it even started. "Amelia, come on." She blinked slowly. "Come on." Daniel dropped his phone onto the counter beside him. "I said we would celebrate this weekend. That is not the point." He rubbed one hand across his forehead immediately, irritation surfacing beneath his calm billionaire composure. "You always do this." Amelia frowned slightly. "Do what?" "Turn everything into some emotional crisis." The sentence landed softly between them, but Amelia physically felt something inside her chest tighten. Daniel walked toward the refrigerator and poured himself sparkling water like they were discussing weather instead of the slow death of their marriage. "I had investors flying in from 3 countries today," he continued. "You act like I skipped dinner just to upset you." Amelia lowered her eyes toward the marble countertop. "I never said that." "Then what exactly are you saying?" She opened her mouth carefully, already choosing words that would sound reasonable enough for him to accept. "I think I miss you." Daniel stared at her for 2 seconds before laughing quietly beneath his breath. Not cruelly, almost casually, like the statement itself sounded naive. "Amelia," he sighed, "you are overthinking things again." There it was. The sentence she had heard so many times over the years that it no longer sounded surprising. Sensitive, emotional, dramatic, overthinking. Daniel always had a polished vocabulary for minimizing pain without technically sounding unkind. Amelia looked toward the snowy skyline outside the windows while her vision blurred faintly. "I am not trying to fight," she whispered. Daniel softened slightly then, probably mistaking her silence for surrender. He stepped closer and kissed the top of her head absent-mindedly, while checking another email notification lighting up his phone. "Get some sleep," he murmured. "You will feel better tomorrow." Amelia sat motionless after he disappeared down the hallway toward his office. Then slowly, very quietly, she stood from the kitchen island and carried both untouched anniversary plates into the sink. The sound of porcelain touching marble echoed through the enormous penthouse, while snow continued falling softly outside. Later that night, Amelia stood alone beneath steaming shower water with one trembling hand covering her mouth to stop herself from crying loudly enough for Daniel to hear through the walls. Because the most exhausting part was not being lonely. It was constantly being told her loneliness was irrational. The most dangerous moment in a failing marriage is not when the arguments become louder. It is when one person finally becomes too tired to keep explaining why they hurt. 2 weeks after their forgotten anniversary dinner, the Hayes penthouse felt strangely peaceful for the first time in years. No emotional conversations. No quiet crying behind bathroom doors. No tense silences waiting for someone to apologize. Daniel noticed the difference immediately, and at first, he thought things were finally improving. Amelia no longer questioned his late nights. She stopped asking when he would be home. She no longer sat awake in the living room pretending to watch television while waiting for the sound of the elevator opening after midnight. Instead, she simply moved through the apartment quietly, almost weightless, like someone slowly emotionally detaching from a life she once fought desperately to protect. One snowy Thursday morning, pale winter lights spilled across the marble kitchen while Daniel adjusted his cufflinks near the counter preparing for another investor meeting downtown. Amelia stood nearby pouring coffee into a travel mug wearing a long camel coat over a soft gray sweater. Her blonde hair was pinned back loosely, and for the first time in months, her face looked strangely calm. Daniel glanced toward her while checking emails on his phone. "You heading somewhere?" he asked absently. Amelia nodded once. "Art Foundation meeting." Daniel frowned slightly. "You started volunteering again?" "A few weeks ago." The answer caught him off guard. A few weeks ago. How had he not noticed? Amelia used to talk constantly about her work with community art spaces before Daniel's business empire slowly consumed every corner of their schedule. Somewhere along the way, she stopped bringing it up because his responses always sounded distracted. "That is good," he said after a pause. Amelia smiled politely. "I think so too." Then she picked up her bag and walked toward the elevator without another word. Daniel stood alone in the kitchen afterward, staring briefly at the closed elevator doors while something unfamiliar settled quietly in his chest. The apartment suddenly felt colder after she left. That afternoon, Amelia sat inside a renovated art center near River North, surrounded by unfinished canvases, architectural models, and the soft scent of paint drying beneath warm, overhead lighting. Snow drifted slowly beyond the warehouse windows while volunteers prepared materials for an upcoming fundraising event supporting local youth art programs. For the first time in years, Amelia felt useful outside being someone's wife. "You organized this entire display wall yourself?" A calm voice asked behind her. Amelia turned and found a tall man in a navy wool coat studying the layout beside her. Mid-40s maybe. Clean cut. Quiet confidence. "Mostly," she answered softly. "It looks incredible." She almost dismissed the compliment automatically out of habit, then stopped herself. "Thank you." The man extended his hand politely. "Lucas Bennett." Amelia shook his hand gently. "Amelia Hayes." Lucas glanced around the room again before smiling faintly. "You notice emotional detail in spaces," he said. "Most people only focus on aesthetics." Amelia blinked in surprise. Nobody had described her work that accurately in years. "That might be the nicest thing anyone has said to me in a while," she admitted quietly before realizing how honest the sentence sounded. Lucas studied her carefully for a second, but did not interrupt. Did not laugh. Did not minimize the emotion hiding beneath her words. He simply listened. Amelia almost forgot what that felt like. Later that evening, Daniel returned home earlier than usual carrying expensive takeout from Amelia's favorite restaurant downtown. Some part of him wanted to reconnect, even if he could not fully explain why lately the penthouse no longer felt emotionally stable. "Amelia?" he called while stepping inside. No answer. The apartment remained softly quiet except for jazz drifting from hidden speakers. Then he noticed a handwritten note resting beside the kitchen island. "Dinner with the Art Foundation team. Do not wait up." Daniel stared at the note for several seconds longer than necessary. Strange. Amelia always informed him weeks ahead whenever she had plans. She used to revolve her entire schedule around his availability. Now she sounded almost independent. The realization unsettled him more than it should have. Around 11 that night, Amelia returned home with snow dusted lightly across her coat sleeves and faint laughter still lingering in her expression from the evening. Daniel looked up immediately from the couch. "You seem happy," he said carefully. Amelia paused briefly before answering. "I forgot I was allowed to be." The sentence hit Daniel harder than he expected, though he could not fully understand why. Amelia disappeared quietly down the hallway toward the bedroom a moment later, leaving Daniel alone beneath the cold blue glow of the city skyline, while an uncomfortable thought slowly formed inside his mind for the very first time. He was beginning to lose emotional access to his wife. Women do not emotionally leave all at once. They leave in quiet pieces every time their pain is treated like an inconvenience instead of something worthy of care. February settled heavily across Chicago, covering rooftops and sidewalks in pale layers of snow, while Amelia Hayes slowly began rebuilding parts of herself inside spaces Daniel no longer noticed. The Art Foundation near River North became her refuge 3 afternoons a week. Warm lighting, the smell of paint and coffee. People who listened when someone spoke instead of waiting impatiently for conversations to end. Amelia had forgotten how peaceful that felt. One Wednesday evening, she stood near a large display wall adjusting framed sketches for the upcoming charity exhibit while soft jazz drifted through the studio speakers. Volunteers moved around the room, carrying floral arrangements and lighting equipment beneath exposed industrial beams. Outside the tall windows, snow blurred the city into silver and blue shadows. "You rearranged the entire room again," Lucas Bennett said quietly from behind her. Amelia turned with a faint smile. Lucas stood nearby holding 2 paper coffee cups while snow melted lightly against the shoulders of his charcoal coat. "The lighting felt cold before," she explained softly. "Now people will naturally look toward the center display first." Lucas glanced around the room slowly before nodding. "You pay attention to emotional atmosphere," he said. "Most designers only focus on appearance." Amelia accepted the coffee carefully from his hand. "You always notice details nobody else sees." Lucas smiled faintly. "That is usually because nobody else is really paying attention." The sentence lingered quietly between them. Amelia lowered her eyes toward the coffee cup, warming her hands while something inside her chest tightened unexpectedly. Not romance. Not yet. Just the strange ache of finally being around someone who listened without dismissing her feelings halfway through a sentence. "Can I ask you something?" Lucas said after a moment. Amelia nodded. "Why do you apologize before every opinion you give?" She blinked in surprise. "I do not." "You do," he answered gently. "You say things like, 'This might sound silly,' or 'I am probably overthinking it,' before speaking." Amelia went still, because she had never noticed she did that. Daniel always used those exact phrases whenever she tried expressing emotions he considered inconvenient. Overthinking, emotional, sensitive, dramatic. Somewhere along the way, she unconsciously learned to invalidate herself before anyone else had the chance to do it first. "Habit, I guess," she whispered quietly. Lucas studied her carefully, but never pushed further. That was what felt safest about him. He never demanded emotional explanations from wounds he could already see hurting. Later that night, Amelia returned to the penthouse carrying rolled sketches beneath one arm while snowflakes melted against her coat sleeves. The apartment was unusually bright when she entered. Soft music played through hidden speakers. Candles glowed near the kitchen island. Daniel stood near the counter pouring wine into 2 glasses. Amelia stopped in visible surprise. "You are home early." Daniel forced a small smile. "Thought maybe we could actually spend an evening together." Amelia looked at him quietly while removing her coat. A few months ago, this effort would have meant everything to her. Now it mostly made her sad, because she knew he was reacting to distance, not understanding the reason behind it. During dinner, Daniel tried harder than usual. He asked about the Art Foundation, about her sketches, about the exhibit happening Friday night. But every question sounded slightly unnatural, like someone reading emotional instructions from a language they stopped speaking years ago. Amelia answered politely while watching him across the candlelight. He really was trying now. The tragedy was that she no longer trusted the timing. Halfway through dinner, Daniel's phone buzzed beside his wine glass. He reached for it automatically before catching himself halfway. Amelia noticed. Of course she did. Daniel slowly placed the phone face down against the table. "It can wait." Amelia stared at him for a second before looking away toward the snowy skyline outside the windows. "You do not have to pretend with me," she said softly. Daniel frowned. "Pretend what?" "That work suddenly matters less than I do." Silence settled heavily across the kitchen. Daniel looked genuinely unsettled by the sentence. "That is not fair." Amelia almost smiled sadly at the irony. For years she had explained loneliness carefully, gently, patiently. But now that she finally sounded emotionally detached, Daniel suddenly called it unfair. He leaned forward slightly. "I am trying here." Amelia nodded slowly. "I know." Her voice carried no anger anymore. That frightened him more than arguments ever had, because the absence of emotion felt colder than conflict. Later that night, Daniel stood alone beside the penthouse windows watching Amelia asleep on the couch with one of her sketchbooks resting open across her lap. Snow drifted softly outside, while warm city lights reflected against the glass around them. Daniel stared at her for a long moment before a realization settled heavily into his chest. He was beginning to understand that Amelia no longer sounded emotional because she had finally stopped expecting him to hear her. Sometimes the most heartbreaking thing about losing someone is realizing they stopped fighting for your attention long before they stopped loving you. The shift inside the Hayes penthouse became impossible for Daniel to ignore by the middle of February. Amelia no longer reacted emotionally when he worked late. She no longer asked whether he would be home for dinner. She no longer looked disappointed when another business trip suddenly appeared on the calendar. At first, Daniel thought this calmer version of his wife meant their marriage was finally stabilizing after months of tension. But slowly, the silence began feeling unnatural. Empty, like walking through a beautifully furnished house after all the warmth has quietly disappeared. One snowy Sunday morning, Daniel walked into the kitchen expecting the familiar smell of coffee and hearing Amelia softly humming beside the windows like she used to years ago. Instead, the apartment felt strangely still. He found her sitting alone at the marble island sketching interior concepts into a notebook while pale winter sunlight reflected softly across the room. Her blonde hair was shorter now, just slightly below her shoulders instead of halfway down her back. Daniel stopped immediately. "Did you cut your hair?" Amelia glanced up calmly. 3 weeks ago. Daniel stared at her for a second, uncomfortable with the realization that he had completely missed something she once would have been excited for him to notice. "It looks nice," he said carefully. Amelia offered a polite smile before returning to the sketchbook. The interaction lasted less than 30 seconds, but Daniel walked away carrying an unfamiliar heaviness in his chest. He was beginning to realize how much of Amelia's life existed now outside his awareness. Later that afternoon, Amelia arrived at the Art Foundation wearing a soft ivory coat, while volunteers prepared final details for Friday night's gala fundraiser. Warm overhead lights reflected against exposed brick walls and framed artwork, while jazz music drifted quietly through the studio. Lucas Bennett stood near the display area reviewing seating layouts with event coordinators. When he noticed Amelia entering, his expression softened immediately. "You made it through the snow," he said with a small smile. Amelia laughed quietly while brushing melted snowflakes from her sleeves. "Barely." Lucas handed her a warm coffee cup without asking how she took it anymore, because by now he already remembered. Small details, tiny acts of attention. Amelia had spent years forgetting those things mattered until someone started offering them naturally again. As they worked side by side arranging artwork beneath soft lighting, Lucas occasionally asked her opinions about design flow, guest experience, and emotional atmosphere. Every time she answered, he listened fully. No interruptions, no distracted phone glances, no subtle impatience. And the frightening part was how emotional safety started feeling unfamiliar to her after living without it so long. "Can I tell you something strange?" Amelia asked quietly while adjusting a framed watercolor piece against the wall. Lucas looked toward her. "Of course." Amelia hesitated briefly. "I think I forgot who I was before I started trying so hard to be easy for someone else to love." The room became still around them for a moment. Lucas did not immediately respond with advice or reassurance. He simply looked at her with quiet understanding. "That happens to people more often than they admit," he said softly. Amelia swallowed hard and looked away before emotions could rise too visibly into her expression. Back at the penthouse that evening, Daniel sat alone inside his home office staring blankly at an unfinished email while snow moved heavily outside the windows behind him. He could hear Amelia laughing faintly somewhere down the hallway during a phone conversation, and the sound caught his attention immediately because he had not heard genuine laughter from her in months. Maybe longer. Daniel stood slowly and followed the sound toward the living room. Amelia sat curled beneath a blanket near the fireplace, speaking softly through wireless headphones while absent-mindedly sketching in her notebook. Her face looked lighter somehow, younger. Daniel paused in the hallway unseen for several seconds while something sharp moved unexpectedly through his chest. Jealousy. Not because he thought she was cheating, because someone else was reaching emotional parts of Amelia he had ignored for years. Amelia looked up suddenly and noticed him standing there. "Everything okay?" she asked softly after ending the call. Daniel nodded too quickly. Yeah. Who were you talking to? Amelia closed the notebook gently. People from the foundation. Daniel studied her expression carefully, but she looked completely calm. That calmness unsettled him more every day now, because Amelia no longer sounded like a woman begging to be understood. She sounded like someone slowly learning she deserved better than being dismissed every time she felt hurt. The scariest part about emotional distance is that most people do not recognize it until the person they love stops reaching for them completely. Snow fell heavily across Chicago the night of the charity gala, turning the city outside into blurred silver light beneath the skyscrapers. Inside the Lakeshore Art Foundation ballroom, warm chandeliers reflected across polished marble floors, while quiet orchestra music drifted through conversations between investors, philanthropists, and wealthy guests dressed in black tuxedos and silk evening gowns. Amelia Hayes stood near the entrance adjusting the sleeve of her dark sapphire dress, while soft golden lighting moved across her face. She looked elegant tonight, but calmer than elegant. Peaceful in a way Daniel had not seen in years. You look nervous, Lucas Bennett said quietly beside her. Amelia glanced toward him with a faint smile. Lucas wore a perfectly tailored charcoal tuxedo, one hand resting casually in his pocket while snowflakes melted slowly against his coat from outside. I am not nervous, she answered softly. Then what are you? Amelia looked across the crowded ballroom thoughtfully. I think I finally stopped trying so hard. Lucas studied her for a second before nodding gently like he understood exactly what she meant. Across the room, Daniel Hayes stood beside several investors discussing a merger deal while holding a glass of whiskey untouched in one hand. But the moment his eyes landed on Amelia, the entire conversation around him seemed to disappear into background noise. She looked different tonight. Not more beautiful exactly, more emotionally alive. There was color in her expression again, warmth, presence. And standing beside her was the same man Daniel increasingly heard mentioned through foundation events and charity conversations over the past several weeks. Lucas Bennett. Daniel recognized the name immediately now. Luxury architect, philanthropist, one of the most respected development partners in Chicago. Daniel crossed the ballroom slowly, unable to ignore the sharp unease tightening through his chest. Amelia, he said warmly after reaching them. Amelia turned calmly toward him. You made it. Daniel forced a small smile before glancing toward Lucas. Lucas Bennett. We finally meet properly. Lucas shook his hand politely. Daniel. The tension between the three of them remained subtle enough that nobody nearby noticed it, but Daniel felt it immediately. Not because Lucas acted possessive or disrespectful. Quite the opposite. The man carried himself with calm restraint. That somehow unsettled Daniel more. Throughout the evening, Daniel found himself watching Amelia constantly from across the ballroom. The way she laughed quietly during conversations. The way guests naturally gravitated toward her warmth. The way Lucas listened whenever she spoke, fully attentive without interrupting once. Daniel suddenly realized how long it had been since he truly listened to his wife, without multitasking mentally through emails and business deadlines at the same time. Halfway through the event, the foundation director stepped onto the stage beneath soft spotlighting and welcomed guests before announcing the featured contributors for the evening's restoration initiative supporting community art programs across Chicago. Large digital screens illuminated around the ballroom displaying architectural concepts, interior sketches, and emotional design presentations for future community spaces. Then Amelia's name appeared across the screen. Daniel froze instantly. Tonight, the director announced proudly, we would like to recognize Amelia Hayes for leading the emotional design vision behind the Lakeshore Creative Renewal Project. Applause filled the ballroom. Amelia looked visibly surprised while Lucas smiled quietly beside her. Daniel stared toward the stage in complete disbelief. He had no idea. Not about the project. Not about the recognition. Not about any of it. Amelia walked slowly toward the stage while warm golden light reflected across the polished floor beneath her heels. For a moment, Daniel barely recognized the woman standing beneath the spotlight. Not because she changed into someone new. Because he was finally seeing the version of her he stopped paying attention to years ago. Then the foundation director continued speaking. We would also like to thank Lucas Bennett for personally funding the project expansion after recognizing Amelia's extraordinary emotional vision for restorative design. Another wave of applause moved through the ballroom. Daniel turned slowly toward Lucas, stunned. But nothing hurt more than what came next. As Amelia stepped down from the stage, she stumbled slightly against the edge of her dress. Before Daniel could even react, Lucas reached forward calmly and adjusted the fabric away from her heels while asking quietly, "You okay?" Such a small gesture. Gentle. Instinctive. But Daniel physically felt something collapse inside his chest watching another man treat his wife with more emotional attentiveness in 3 seconds than he had shown her in years. And standing there beneath crystal chandeliers while applause echoed softly through the ballroom, Daniel Hayes finally understood the terrifying truth he had ignored for far too long. Amelia was no longer emotionally waiting for him to notice her. People think heartbreak begins when someone leaves. The truth is, heartbreak begins the moment someone realizes they no longer feel emotionally safe beside the person they love. 2 nights after the charity gala, snowstorm warnings rolled across Chicago while cold wind rattled softly against the glass walls of the Hayes penthouse. Daniel stood alone inside his office, staring blankly at financial projections glowing across his computer screen, but none of the numbers held his attention anymore. All he could see was Amelia standing beneath ballroom lights beside Lucas Bennett looking more emotionally alive than she had in years. The image haunted him, not because she looked in love with another man, because she looked free from the sadness Daniel himself had slowly normalized. He closed the laptop heavily and rubbed both hands across his face. Somewhere down the hallway, soft music drifted through the apartment. Amelia was awake. Daniel stood and followed the sound quietly until he reached the living room doorway. Amelia sat near the fireplace wearing loose cream-colored loungewear with watercolor sketches spread across the coffee table around her. Snow moved heavily outside the floor-to-ceiling windows while golden firelight softened the room. She looked peaceful again. That peace terrified him now. "You are still awake," Daniel said softly. Amelia looked up calmly. "Could not sleep." Daniel stepped farther into the room. "Can we talk?" Amelia hesitated briefly before nodding once. Daniel sat across from her while silence settled heavily between them. He suddenly realized how long it had been since they simply sat together without phones, meetings, or distractions interrupting every moment. "You have changed lately," he said carefully. Amelia looked down at the sketches in her lap. "Maybe I finally stopped pretending I was okay." Daniel swallowed hard. "Why did you never tell me things were this bad?" The question hung painfully in the air. Amelia slowly lifted her eyes toward him then, disbelief flickering softly across her expression. "I tried for years, Daniel." The sentence hit him instantly because somewhere deep down, he knew she was right. He remembered now. The quiet conversations he rushed through. The nights she cried beside him while he promised they would talk later. The countless moments he minimized her pain because it felt emotionally inconvenient compared to business emergencies and investor crises. Daniel leaned forward slowly. "I thought you were just overwhelmed sometimes." Amelia gave the smallest, saddest smile. "That is exactly the problem." Snow tapped softly against the windows while the fire crackled low between them. Daniel stared at her face carefully, noticing details he ignored for too long. The exhaustion beneath her calmness. The emotional distance replacing the warmth she once carried naturally around him. "Who is Lucas to you?" he finally asked quietly. Amelia looked surprised by the question, then strangely tired. "Someone who listens." Daniel lowered his eyes briefly. Jealousy moved through him immediately, but underneath it lived something far worse. Shame. Because another man was now offering Amelia the emotional attentiveness she spent years begging for inside her own marriage. "Are you in love with him?" Daniel asked after a long silence. Amelia looked toward the snowstorm outside before answering honestly. "I do not know." The truth shattered something inside him. Not because she sounded cruel, because she sounded emotionally uncertain in a way she never had before. Daniel stood abruptly and walked toward the windows, breathing unevenly now. "I can fix this," he said quickly. "I know I have been distant lately, but I can do better." Amelia watched him quietly from the couch. "Why now?" Daniel turned toward her immediately. "Because I am finally realizing what I could lose." Amelia's eyes softened with heartbreak instead of comfort. "That is what hurts the most." Daniel frowned slightly. "What?" She lowered her voice almost to a whisper. "You only started hearing me after someone else finally did." Silence filled the penthouse completely. Daniel physically felt the truth of her words settle into his chest. For years, Amelia tried explaining loneliness gently, patiently, lovingly. But he only panicked once her sadness stopped revolving around him entirely. Amelia slowly gathered the sketches from the coffee table and stood. "I am tired, Daniel." He stepped toward her instinctively. "Amelia," but she shook her head softly before he could continue. "You spent so long calling me emotional that eventually I stopped feeling emotionally safe with you at all." Then she walked quietly down the hallway toward the bedroom, while snow continued falling heavily across Chicago outside, leaving Daniel standing alone beside the fire, realizing he was finally experiencing the same emotional isolation Amelia had lived with for years. The end of a marriage rarely arrives in one dramatic moment. Sometimes it arrives quietly on an ordinary evening when one person finally realizes they no longer have the strength to keep begging for emotional safety. 3 days after their conversation beside the fireplace, Chicago disappeared beneath one of the heaviest snowstorms of the winter. Wind swept across the skyline while pale gray light filled the Hayes penthouse in cold silence. Daniel barely slept anymore. He spent most nights replaying old conversations inside his mind, suddenly hearing things Amelia had tried to tell him years earlier that he dismissed too quickly to truly understand. The loneliness inside the apartment felt different now. Before, Amelia carried it alone. Now Daniel could feel it everywhere. In the quiet kitchen, in the untouched dining table, in the growing emotional distance between them that no expensive gesture seemed capable of repairing anymore. That evening, Daniel canceled 2 investor meetings and returned home before sunset carrying white roses from Amelia's favorite florist downtown. Snow clung to the shoulders of his dark overcoat, while cold wind followed him briefly into the penthouse. "Amelia," he called softly. No answer. He walked farther inside and froze when he noticed several large storage boxes stacked neatly near the hallway wall. His chest tightened instantly. Daniel dropped the flowers onto the kitchen island and moved quickly toward the bedroom. Amelia stood beside the bed, folding sweaters carefully into an open suitcase, while warm lamplight softened the room around her. The sight physically stopped him. "What is this?" he asked quietly. Amelia did not answer immediately. She simply folded another sweater slowly before placing it into the suitcase. "I found an apartment near River North," she said softly. Daniel stared at her in complete disbelief. "You are moving out?" Amelia finally looked toward him then. Calm. Exhausted. Certain. "I think I need to." Panic moved sharply through Daniel's chest. "Amelia, wait." He stepped farther into the room while snow hit the windows behind them. "Do not do this." Amelia lowered her eyes briefly. "I stayed longer than I should have already." Daniel shook his head immediately. "No, we can fix this." She almost smiled sadly at the sentence. "You only started trying once I stopped fighting for your attention." Daniel swallowed hard because he knew she was right. Every meaningful conversation between them during the past month only happened after he realized someone else saw value in her emotionally. "That is not fair," he whispered weakly. Amelia zipped the suitcase halfway, closed before answering. "Neither was spending years being told my feelings were too much every time I tried explaining why I was hurting." Silence filled the room. Daniel suddenly looked smaller standing there beneath the soft bedroom lighting. Less like a billionaire who controlled entire industries. More like a man realizing too late that emotional neglect destroys people slowly and quietly. "I never meant to hurt you," he said. Amelia's eyes softened slightly. "I know." The answer devastated him more than anger could have, because she truly believed him. Daniel was not cruel in obvious ways. That was what made the loneliness worse. He simply dismissed her pain so consistently that eventually she stopped trusting herself enough to express it anymore. Daniel stepped closer carefully. "Tell me what to do." Amelia looked away toward the snowy skyline outside the windows. "That is the problem, Daniel." Her voice trembled faintly now for the first time all evening. "I spent years teaching you how to love me gently." Daniel closed his eyes briefly as guilt crashed through him. He remembered now. The anniversary dinners he missed. The tears he called overreactions. The countless nights Amelia tried reaching him emotionally while he stayed distracted by work, emails, flights, meetings, and everything else he convinced himself mattered more temporarily. Temporary became years. Amelia reached toward the nightstand slowly and picked up a small envelope resting beside the lamp. Then she walked past Daniel toward the kitchen without another word. Confused, He followed her through the silent penthouse until they reached the marble island beneath soft pendant lights. Amelia carefully placed the envelope onto the counter between them. Daniel looked down. Divorce papers. His breathing stopped for half a second. No, he whispered immediately. Amelia stood quietly across from him while snowstorm winds rattled faintly against the glass walls surrounding the city below. Daniel looked up at her desperately. You are overreacting. The sentence escaped automatically, instinctively. The same sentence he used every time her emotions became inconvenient for him to process. Amelia stared at him silently for several seconds. Then heartbreak moved softly across her face because even now, after everything, he still did not fully hear what she was saying. That sentence, she whispered quietly, is exactly what destroyed our marriage. Sometimes people do not realize they destroyed something beautiful until they are forced to sit alone inside the silence they created themselves. The snowstorm finally ended the morning Amelia Hayes left the penthouse. Chicago looked pale and quiet beneath the winter sunrise, while soft light reflected across frozen streets 30 floors below. Inside the apartment, everything felt still except for the faint sound of suitcase wheels rolling slowly across marble floors. Amelia stood near the elevator wearing a long cream-colored coat with one hand wrapped around the handle of her suitcase. Her blonde hair rested softly against her shoulders again, and for the first time in years, she no longer looked emotionally exhausted. Sad, yes, but no longer trapped. Daniel stood several feet away near the apartment doorway, watching her in complete silence. Neither of them had slept after the divorce papers appeared on the kitchen island the night before. Daniel looked older somehow now. Not physically, emotionally, like regret had finally caught up to him all at once. Amelia, he said quietly. She looked up. Daniel swallowed hard before speaking again. Please do not go like this. Amelia's eyes softened slightly, but she did not step closer. I stayed through every version of lonely I could survive, she answered gently. I just cannot survive this one anymore. The elevator chimed softly behind her, doors sliding open beneath warm hallway lights. Daniel stared at her desperately, while panic moved visibly through his expression. I can change. Amelia nodded once. I know you probably can. The answer stunned him because there was no bitterness inside it. No revenge. No cruelty. Just devastating honesty. Daniel stepped forward instinctively. Then why does this feel final? Amelia looked down briefly before answering. Because I needed you to care years ago, not after I finally stopped asking. Silence settled between them while morning light filled the hallway around their shadows. Daniel suddenly realized the cruelest part of losing Amelia was understanding she still loved him somewhere beneath all the heartbreak. She simply no longer trusted him emotionally enough to stay. Amelia reached slowly into her coat pocket and removed her wedding ring. The gold band reflected softly beneath the overhead lighting while Daniel stared at it, like something sacred breaking apart in front of him. She placed it gently onto the marble entry table beside the elevator. I never wanted a perfect husband, she whispered quietly. I just wanted to feel emotionally safe with mine. Daniel physically looked like the sentence hurt to hear, because for the first time, he fully understood what emotional neglect actually meant. It was not dramatic cruelty. It was making someone feel irrational every time they needed comfort until eventually they stopped believing their feelings deserved care at all. Amelia stepped into the elevator slowly while snowmelt dripped quietly from the city rooftops outside. Daniel stood frozen in the hallway watching the woman he loved disappear emotionally beyond his reach. Did you ever stop loving me? He asked suddenly, voice breaking softly. Amelia looked at him one final time while tears gathered faintly in her eyes. No, she admitted. I just stopped feeling safe enough to keep loving you the same way. Then the elevator doors closed gently between them. Daniel remained standing there long after the elevator disappeared. Hours later, the penthouse no longer felt like home. It felt enormous. Hollow. The silence inside every room pressed heavily against him now. Amelia's favorite blanket no longer rested near the fireplace. Her sketches were gone from the kitchen island. Half the closet stood empty beneath cold recessed lighting. Daniel wandered slowly through the apartment, noticing emotional absences everywhere like echoes of a life he neglected until it vanished. He eventually stopped near the living room windows overlooking Chicago where Amelia once sat quietly night after night waiting for him to notice she was hurting. His phone buzzed repeatedly nearby with calls from investors, assistants, and business partners, but Daniel ignored every notification. None of it sounded important anymore. Then his eyes landed on something resting beside the couch. Amelia's old sketchbook. He picked it up slowly and opened the final page. Beneath a watercolor painting of the Chicago skyline, Amelia had written one sentence in soft, careful handwriting that completely shattered whatever composure Daniel still had left. I was never too emotional. I was simply unheard for too long. Daniel lowered himself slowly into the empty living room while pale winter sunlight filled the penthouse around him. And for the first time in his entire life, the silence he once ignored finally became unbearable.